Hi, everyone. Welcome back for the second night of Defending Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, where we will look at the evidence to decide which explanation of creation is the most logical, the secular or biblical worldviews. Before we ended last night, we looked in some depth at the Big Bang and how creationism responds to this. Tonight, we will look at more of creation science's arguments against some of the key elements of the secular worldview. These are the age of the earth, 4.5 billion years or 6,000 years. Did life on earth begin with a random combination of chemicals and electricity? Could evolution happen the way they say it does? In other words, the mechanics of evolution. What is the evidence that mankind evolved from an ape-like, non-human creature? Where do dinosaurs fit into all this? Why should we believe in the worldwide flood and the Tower of Babel, and why are they not myths? There is much more to creation science than what I will be able to cover tonight. I will highlight the arguments that most resonate with me. If you want to learn more, please see me after the talk when I can give you reference material. Boy, can I give you reference material. There are many books, videos, websites, blogs, etc. on the subject. One book in particular that has been very helpful to me in putting this talk together has been Creation and Evolution by J. Seegert, and I would recommend that book if you're looking for a good overview on the subject. Also, after the service tomorrow, we'll be handing out a very good overview from Doug Batchelor called Creation and Evolution, Examining the Evidence. Before we delve into these questions, let's have a few words of prayer. Oh God, as we begin the second night of our talks, help us to better understand the wonders of your creation. Help us to understand all the evidence you show us to appreciate your design of all things. And help us come away with an even greater appreciation than before of your awesome power in designing our universe. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord, amen. Is the Earth really 4.5 billion years old? The idea that the Earth is very old is key to understanding the secular worldview. If the Earth is not millions and billions of years old, none of the rest of it works. There's no time for geologic features to form gradually, not enough time for single-cell organisms to evolve into much larger, complex ones through random processes, and no time for man to have evolved from ape-like creatures. This is why the uniformitarianism, if you remember that word from last night, that we talked about earlier is so important to that worldview. Uniformitarianism says that the Grand Canyon, for example, formed from erosion from the Colorado River over millions of years. But is that the most likely answer? Creationists will point to the worldwide flood as being a more likely reason. That onrushing water from a catastrophic event, the flood, dug out the canyon in a relatively short time, probably days rather than millions of years. That such a scenario is possible and even likely can be shown by the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State in March of 1982. That explosive eruption caused mud flows and snow avalanches which carved out a canyon 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon in only 9 hours. It's called the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle River. I will talk more about Mount St. Helens eruptions later. Another strong argument that the Grand Canyon was not created simply by millions of years of erosion is that the Colorado River enters the canyon at 2,800 feet above sea level, and it leaves at 1,800 feet. Now, so far, so good for the erosion theory. But the highest point in the canyon that the river flows through is 7,000 feet among sea level. If the canyon was formed solely by erosion from the river, then the river must have at some point flowed upward 4,200 feet to erode its current course through the canyon. And rivers don't flow upward according to science. Now, it should be noted that there really is no direct evidence of the age of the Earth. Instead, secular scientists, when they try to assert an old Earth, try to infer the age of the Earth indirectly. There are two common techniques for this: radiometric dating and the geologic column, which we mentioned last night. Often, circular reasoning connects these. Okay, first I'm going to talk about radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is based on measuring how long unstable radioactive elements take to transform into stable non-radioactive elements. An example of this is radioactive potassium transforming into argon, which would take 1.25 billion years. From the amount of argon in a given rock compared to the potassium, secular scientists will estimate the age of the rock and usually come up with millions of years in age. The problem with this method, though, is that its validity depends on a number of assumptions which may not be true. It makes assumptions about the starting point of the radioactive element, the rate at which it converts to the stable element, and how much of the stable element was there to begin with. Okay, to illustrate this more simply, take the example of a bathtub full of water, which you measure at 20 gallons. And the faucet is open and filling at a rate of 2 gallons per minute. So how long has the tap been running? Most people would say 10 minutes, based on what you know. But that answer assumes a few things: that the tub was empty when the water started running, and nobody increased or decreased the flow of the tap before you saw it. But what if the tub was already half full when the faucet began running? Then the answer becomes 5 minutes. And what if at some point the faucet had been running faster? That could change the answer to, say, 10 minutes. And so it is with radiometric dating. Another flaw in the reasoning from a biblical point of view is that everything is presumed to come about through natural processes. Uranium-235, which was the key element in making the first atomic bombs, would take 4.5 billion years to decay into lead. Does that mean that all lead-bearing rock is 4.5 billion years old? Well, only if you assume that there was no creator of the earth who may have created that rock with lead in it 6,000 years ago. It all depends on your worldview and assumptions. Now, as a result of the weaknesses in radiometric dating, when it is applied to real-world examples, it will generate results that are obviously false. To quote Siegert, page 211, "There are numerous examples of dating errors that have come from attempting to date rocks of known ages. One such instance is that of a lava flow in Hawaii, known to have taken place between 1800 and 1801. The rocks were dated using the potassium-argon method, yielding an age just shy of 3 billion years old. There are many others that could be listed. Not only are we aware of erroneous results regarding rocks of known ages, but the various methods used by those claiming the Earth is billions of years old are often in conflict with each other. One example is that of rock samples from the Bass Sills in the Grand Canyon. The potassium-argon method yielded an age of approximately 842 million years. However, the samarium-neodymium method yielded an age of approximately 1.379 billion years. That's a difference of 537 million years. Other examples were discussed in the book Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air, page 192. It talks about a lava dome in Mount St. Helens formed in 1986, but dating at 350,000 years using the potassium-argon method. And lava from Mount Guaraho in New Zealand, now that's known as Mount Doom to all the Lord of the Rings fans, tested between 270,000 and 3.5 billion years old, even though, although it is known that the lava flows occurred between 1949 and 1979. Another radiometric dating technique is fairly well known, the carbon-14 method. A lot of people have heard of that. From a creationist perspective, this is of special interest. Living things maintain a certain proportion of carbon-14, which is unstable and radioactive, to carbon-12, which is stable, non-radioactive. When the living thing dies, the carbon-14 begins to decay. So by seeing the proportion of carbon-14 left in, say, a fossil, the age of that fossil can be estimated. Many people believe that carbon-14 dating is what establishes the millions of years ago age of fossils, but that's not true. Carbon-14 would fully decay in 60,000 years. So despite common belief, carbon-14 dating cannot substantiate the idea that fossils are millions of years old or any other age greater than 60,000. But here's the interesting part. Carbon-14 has been found in substances that are believed by secular science to be millions of years old, such as coal, oil, and diamonds. This is further evidence that other radiometric measurement methods are unreliable. Now, let's look at the geologic column, which purports to explain sedimentary layers that are exposed at various places in the world, like the Grand Canyon. These layers are claimed to be deposited one after the other, like rings in a tree, not annually, but over millions of years for each layer. And fossils found in these layers, they say, can be dated based on which layer they're found in, which involves a great deal of circular reasoning. The fossil identifies the layer, and the presumed age of the layer identifies the age of the fossil. It makes for an interesting picture, but the key thing to understand is that the geologic column is not found anywhere in the real world. Yes, there are places where there are sedimentary layers that have been exposed, but nowhere where the complete set of layers, one on top of the other, exists along with the expected fossils to be found in each one, such as the graphic on the right side of the slide imagines. But a more biblical explanation exists for rock stratification, the worldwide flood of Noah. A cataclysmic flood could also have created stratification like what we see in the Grand Canyon, but we don't need to speculate about this. Here's a slide showing rock stratification formed during the Mount St. Helens eruptions. On May 18, 1980, a 5.1 earthquake caused a 20 megaton TNT equivalent steam blast, which caused the largest landslide in recorded history. That strata is on the bottom where the person is standing. Then on June 12, 1980, another eruption resulted in almost 1,000 layers of stratified sediment 25 feet thick, laid down in only 3 hours. The March 1982 eruption's mudflows, which we already noted carved out the canyon in 9 hours, laid down the top sediment layers. This did not take millions of years. And it's appropriate here to point out the existence of polystrate fossils. These are basically fossils, such as trees, that are embedded in the rock strata and span multiple layers. This picture of the polystrate tree is a mic drop impressive illustration to disprove millions of years. If these layers accumulated gradually over millions of years, how did these trees get there that way, straddling multiple layers? It really doesn't fit the theory of the geologic column, but they fit very nicely with the idea of a cataclysmic flood. And again, we have the example of Mount St. Helens, where trees were swept away and are now fossilized in the sedimentary layers at the bottom of Spirit Lake. They didn't grow there. It's the result of a cataclysmic event. What is observed here can explain the petrified forests of Yellowstone Specimen Ridge, which geologists previously assumed resulted from 50 million years of 27 different levels of distinct forest. However, we have proof now of how rapidly rock strata, canyons, and petrified trees can form as a result of catastrophism. As an experiment, creation scientists sent 16 fossils to be tested for carbon-14. These fossils were supposed to be from different ages on the geologic column, all supposed to be many millions of years old and millions of years different from each other. The results showed, first, that all of them had carbon-14, which should not have been present at all in fossils of their supposed age. And second, the amount of carbon-14 was the same, regardless of which layer in the geologic column they came from, despite the supposed millions of years difference in the layers. Next, let's consider the idea that life on Earth began when a purely random combination of chemicals were exposed to electricity from storms that raged across the planet millions of years ago. As with the case for the Big Bang, the first question to ask is, where is the evidence? The idea of non-living chemicals spontaneously combining to form a living cell harkens back to middle school science. Didn't we all learn in middle school science that this is impossible? That living things can only come from other living things, life from life. And didn't Pasteur, among others, prove that life cannot come from non-life? You remember the term abiogenesis? So why do scientists think that it was any different back when they say life began? Again, a supposedly unbreakable law of science is assumed not to have applied just this one time in order for the theory to work. One thing that comes often in examining the scientific case for evolution is that as time goes on and more scientific knowledge is gained, later discoveries often refute previous evolutionary theories. A case in point has to do with DNA and the genome. We now understand that DNA and the genome contain the programming, if you will, that tells a cell how to behave, what its function is, how to create energy, how to dispose of waste, how, in more complex organisms, to interact with other cells, and even when to self-destruct to make way for new cells. Bill Gates makes that analogy when he says, DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever created, and he should know something about programming. Even a single-cell organism is actually a very complex thing, run by DNA with its own genome, just like the cells of more complex organisms. An E. coli bacterium has 4,000 genes, quite a few to have developed at random. DNA is made of 4 types of substances. How they combine and order themselves on the strands of DNA is what tells an organism whether it is a human being, a dog, or a giraffe. Now, to get an idea of how much information is contained on cell DNA, consider this from the Seeger book. A typical human adult has about 100 trillion cells in their body. Each of these cells contains thin strands of DNA. These strands take on the form of a twisted ladder that most people are familiar with. Each cell contains virtually the entire set of information needed for the construction and the daily functioning of our bodies. The sum total of this information is called the genome. All of the information is in an encoded form, determined by the arrangement of nucleotides, similar to how the specific arrangement of letters on a page convey information and meaning. If you were to write out this information from just one cell, it would fill about 1,500-page books. If you were to remove all the DNA strands from all the cells in your body and string them end to end, it would reach from Earth to the Moon 473,000 times. End quote. But this is just the physical DNA that contains the incredible amount of programming. Even if we assume that the substances that make up DNA could evolve at random, how could they evolve at random to actually create information? According to John Sarfati in the book Evolution's Achilles Heels, to explain, the information in a book is not based on the properties of the ink molecules on the paper, but on the way they are arranged into letters, words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs. An ink spill will not generate the plays of Shakespeare. Also note the letters are meaningless unless one understands the language that they're in. End quote. There's no plausible theory on how such massive amounts of information in each cell could have evolved at random all at once, since it all has to be there for a cell to function at all. Paul Davis, physicist and evolutionist, asked in 1999, how did stupid, unguided atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Now that was reported by Sarfati in the book Evolution's Achilles' Heels. Now he continues, remarkably, the decoding machinery, which translates the DNA language, is itself encoded in the DNA, which is a real chicken and egg problem for evolutionists. This Achilles' heel points out a weakness in evolutionary theory that leads to failure. As admitted by Richard Dawkins, well-known evolutionist and atheist, in 2009, the catch-22 of the origin of life is this: DNA can replicate, but it needs enzymes in order to catalyze this process. Proteins can catalyze DNA formation, but they need DNA to specify the correct sequence of amino acids. It seems that Dawkins is agreeing with this Achilles' heel. So does that mean he's become a creationist or even acknowledges that creationism might be valid? No. We've heard from Dawkins before, and he is a committed evolutionist. This demonstrates once again that it is the worldview of people like Dawkins and not scientific evidence that keeps them evolutionists. By the way, we'll hear even more from Dawkins later. There have been attempts to estimate the probability of the non-living substances combining to form life. According to Sir Fred Hoyle in November of 1981, he's the scientist who coined the term Big Bang. Now imagine 100 billion, 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 trillion blind persons, each with a scrambled Rubik cube, and try to conceive of the chance of them all simultaneously arriving at the solved form. You then have the chance of arriving by random shuffling at just one of the many proteins on which life depends. The notion that not only the proteins but the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in the primordial soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. Creation science also has quite a bit to say about the mechanics of evolution. When Darwin formulated his theory, he had no idea what the actual mechanism was that could bring about evolutionary change. Now, we have a much better understanding of DNA, genetics, and inheritance of characteristics from parents to offspring, but these things don't support evolutionary thought. Darwin thought that complex organisms all evolved from simple one-cell organisms. The simplest form of organic life is not, as commonly stated, a cell, but a microscopic lump of jelly-like substance, entirely destitute of texture, destitute of organs, formless lump of albuminous matter with no trace of organization. Well, you're wrong again, Charles. As we discussed earlier, modern understandings of DNA and the genome realize that even the simplest one-cell organisms that we know has a full genome that forms the programming for everything about that organism. The strands of DNA of even the simplest organism contain an incredible amount of data. When cells replicate, they make exact copies of the entire genome. When an organism reproduces sexually, each parent contributes an exact copy of their genome, so that the offspring will be a blend of the genomes of the two parents. So how, as evolutionary theory would have it, can offspring develop characteristics that neither parent has? Their answer is the phenomenon of mutation. The public has an idea that mutations bring about major beneficial changes. Now, for instance, I became familiar with the idea of mutation at the age of 10 by reading X-Men comic books. This group of teenagers all had characteristics that were different from their parents that gave them super abilities. I can see one guy has wings, another shoots force rays from his eyes, and they all had normal, non-super parents. But that was in comic books. What is the reality of mutations? Actually, mutations occur as a result of failure of the genetic code to replicate properly. It's like when computer code becomes corrupted. And just as corrupted computer code causes an application not to work properly, so mutations cause a loss of function. Mutation never adds function to an organism. Keep in mind that natural selection, which can result in different beneficial characteristics, does not depend on DNA mutations to achieve its results. It is simply a recombination of various genes that are already in the genome. So you can account for coloration differences within dogs and cats, for example, through natural selection without having to theorize about gene mutations causing it. Carl Sagan, a well-known atheist and certainly no supporter of creation science, nevertheless put it succinctly. Mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It is rare that a precision machine is improved by random change to the instructions for making it. He said that in 1977. As another aspect of the mechanism of evolution, there should be transitional forms that would show how organism A evolved into organism B. These are often referred to as missing links. When I was growing up, my favorite dinosaur book, along with teaching that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, also pointed to a fossil of Archaeopteryx, which is shown there, which was at that time believed to have been a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds. Now, we'll talk more about Archaeopteryx later. Darwin wrote in his book, "But just in proportion as this process has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record." End quote. In other words, Darwin was confident that these transitional forms would be found as further geological exploration continued. But in fact, they haven't. To quote the Answers in Genesis website, "Are there transitional forms in the fossil record that confirm evolution? Are there, for example, creatures that are half fish and half amphibian, or half reptile and half bird? Are there creatures that are 90% reptile and 10% bird? And then a little higher in the rock record, are there creatures that are 80% reptile and 20% bird? And so on until we find 100% birds in higher rocks? We should find thousands and thousands of transitional fossils if evolution and millions of years are true. But we now have millions of fossils in the world's natural history museums, and the transitional fossils are still missing." In 1979, David Ropp, the famous paleontology professor at the University of Chicago, said, "Well, we are now 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex." Instead of transitional forms, paleontologists have noted the Cambrian explosion. By their reckoning, the world existed for over 4 billion years without producing any sea life that left a trace. Then suddenly, by their evolutionary reasoning, many species of fully evolved sea creatures seem to spring into being without any transitional form for any of them found in the lower rock layers. Look at the right side of the slide. The first two bottom layers covering 4.1 billion years by secular reasoning, show no benchmark fossils. Suddenly, the next layer up, the Cambrian, reflects the Cambrian explosion. It's a major conundrum, but looked at biblically, it sounds a lot like God creating all the varieties of sea creatures on the fifth day. G.K. Chesterton, an English author, philosopher, and a Christian apologist, put it succinctly. All we know of the missing link is that he is still missing, and he won't be missed either. Another argument against the mechanics of evolution is called irreducible complexity. Darwin asserted that life began as single-cell organisms which evolved randomly into all the much more complex organisms that populate the world today. Single-cell organisms don't have either eyes or ears, but all the more complex animals have these. You can certainly see where eyes and ears to allow sight and hearing would provide competitive advantages. But how did they get there? Both are made up of numerous components, which must all work together to provide the sight and hearing. But the individual components don't provide any competitive advantages in and of themselves. So what would be the evolutionary mechanism that produced those components? Looking at the complexity of the eye or ear and how there seems to be no evolutionary reason to develop intermediate steps shows strong evidence of a designer, not blind randomness. Okay, sexual reproduction is yet another area where the mechanics of evolution fall short of explaining a very important aspect of the world around us. Single-cell organisms reproduce asexually, that is, by just dividing in two. But all the larger, more complex life forms reproduce sexually. How did this change occur? At one time, the evolutionists say, all life was single-cell, which reproduced asexually. But at some point, in their minds, at least two of these little amoebas must have mutated to acquire the ability to reproduce sexually. But we've already seen that mutation does not allow an organism to add abilities, only to lose them. Plus, adding these abilities would require a major rewrite of the genetic code. And who would have done this? To suddenly provide the physical means to reproduce sexually. And does that suggest irreducible complexity to anybody? And this had to happen at the same time and in the same place where both a male mutation and a female mutation occurred. There is no logical, convincing explanation that has been offered by the evolutionists as to how all the necessary changes could have come about in a random, unplanned way, or why it seems to have happened in every case as life forms become more complex. Now, nothing about Darwinian evolution has created as much controversy with the general public as what it says about the origins of humanity. Darwin maintained that humans and modern apes all evolved from a common ape-like ancestor. Ever since, secular scientists have been searching for the missing link that could show an evolutionary link that had characteristics of both humans and apes. The result has been a history of claims to have found the missing link between humans and our supposed non-human ancestors, all of which have eventually been debunked. I'm going to give an example. Let's take the Neanderthal man and let's make it personal. When I was a kid, my family took a few trips to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. I really enjoyed those. The museum had dioramas featuring scenes of Neanderthal man, as we see on the slide. The image of Neanderthal man came from the discovery of some bones in 1856 in the Neanderthal Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany. Evolutionists immediately jumped on this as the missing link, a non-human species that bridged the gap between man and ape. Drawings were made from the bones that were discovered that made the Neanderthals look pretty ape-like. The screen has a picture of what a British magazine in 1909 told the public that he looked like. A lot of imagination went into that portrayal to bridge the gap between what was actually known, which is a few bones, and what the scientists wanted them to say about Neanderthal man. The Field Museum continued this image of Neanderthal as one step up from an ape, something not really human. Now, fast forward 50 plus years to a few years ago when our daughter and her husband gave Sue and me each 23andMe kits to find out our genetic ancestry. We sent in the kits and got the results. I was shocked, as in, what? To find that we both had Neanderthal DNA. How could this be? If Neanderthals weren't human, as the evolutionists had said, then how could a distant human ancestor possibly have produced offspring with a Neanderthal? Scientifically, that can't be possible. Of course, I found that in those 50 plus years since I saw the diorama in the Field Museum, scientists had been forced to upgrade the Neanderthals to fully human status. New information had shown that Neanderthals were simply a subgroup of humans, perhaps isolated and inbred during the ice age that followed the flood. They are not a missing link at all. This slide shows a more modern depictions of Neanderthal man. Now, they may not win a prize as the cutest couple, but they are now fully human in their looks. But in the minds of many in the general public, due to the years of presenting Neanderthals and others as genuine missing links, they believe that science has found the missing link that proves human evolution from apes. Now, Siegert's book gives a history of various discoveries of missing links like Neanderthals. They all fall in one of four categories. They're either apes that evolutionists try to make look more human. Now, this includes the famous Lucy discovery in Africa. Or they're humans that evolutionists try to make look more ape-like, such as the Neanderthals. Or they're frauds or mistakes, like Nebraska Man that figured in the Scopes trial in the 1920s. Or they're evidence of something that is neither ape nor human, also Nebraska Man, as it turns out. And of course, there is a problem with sexual reproduction similar to what we discussed earlier. At the point where the ape-like creature mutates into something that is fully human, either male or female, presumably the sole human cannot mate backwards with any of the non-human group that he or she is from. So how exactly is the first human supposed to continue his or her genetic line to eventually produce you and me? Evolutionary theory is silent on this. Another thing that needs addressing is the well-publicized claim by evolutionists that humans and chimpanzees share 96% of their DNA, as if that were proof, even if it were true, that humans and chimps shared anything other than a common designer. But of course, the 96% claim isn't even true, though it is often reported that way. I will let Siegert take it from here. For argument's sake, let's temporarily say that we actually are 96% similar to chimps with respect to our DNA. That leaves a 4% difference. Given that the human genome consists of 3 billion nucleotides, or letters, a 4% difference still represents 120 million nucleotides, or letters, that are different. That would mean in the time since humans supposedly split off from apes, assumed to be about 6 million years ago, these accidental changes to our instruction manual, the genome, are responsible for creating 20,000 pages of highly complex, useful information, all the while not significantly affecting the rest of the manual in any truly detrimental way. This stretches the imagination beyond reason. Now seems an appropriate time to look at an area that is a real battleground between creationists and evolutionists, dinosaurs. It will bring to the forefront a lot of the conflicts we've been talking about, and the secular view of dinosaurs introduces the idea of millions of years to children at a very young age. After all, what little kid doesn't like dinosaurs? I mean, I certainly did. And along with the dinosaur books and toys comes the assertion into every child's brain that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago before man. So why is it important to talk so much about dinosaurs? Well, I will quote from Elaine Graham Kennedy, who has a PhD in geology and is a Seventh-day Adventist, in her book, Dinosaurs. I attended a professional meeting several years ago where teachers heard one speaker say, "We can't take kids who have been raised in a conservative home and convince them in one semester that evolution is true." And another lecturer said, "If we can convince little kids in kindergarten of two things, one, that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, and two, dinosaurs evolved into birds, then we will have them as evolutionists for the rest of their lives." So she says, if you attend a church where there are little kids or big kids, you need to know about dinosaurs. Now, when I read this, I couldn't help thinking about our trip to the Science Museum of Minnesota with the live presentation of the dinosaur with feathers on its back. This evolutionist goal of convincing kids by kindergarten very clearly starts even earlier. Public television, PBS Kids, for example, has a cute animated program called Dinosaur Train, aimed at children as young as 2. Each episode ends with a paleontologist teaching facts, quote unquote, including that some dinosaurs had feathers and that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. 2-year-olds will be absorbing these facts, quote unquote. Here's how secular scientists view dinosaurs and prehistory. They all lived millions of years ago in 3 ages described in the geologic column. The Triassic age, which is 250 to 200 million years ago, the Jurassic age, which is 200 to 145 million years ago, and the Cretaceous age, which was 145 to 66 million years ago. The Triassic had very few of the dinosaurs that are well known today. In the Jurassic, more well-known dinosaurs appear, such as Allosaurus, Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Ichthyosaurus. The Cretaceous witnesses the majority of well-known dinosaurs today: Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, various duck-billed dinosaurs, Plesiosaurus. Each of those periods ended with an extinction event, where most of the dinosaurs in that period seem to have either disappeared altogether or evolved very rapidly into a higher form, leaving no transitional forms. There's a lot of speculation in the secular world over what might have caused these extinction events, but no general agreement even among secular scientists. Evolutionary theory holds that after the dinosaurs died out, mammals became the dominant land animals on Earth. Early humans first appeared in Africa between 6 and 2 million years ago, with modern humans finally appearing in Africa about 300,000 years ago. It is an article of faith among secular scientists that humans and dinosaurs did not coexist. Now, they say there were several ice ages, which gave rise to many types of mammals that adapted to the cold conditions. The creationist view of the same, to no surprise, is very different. Dinosaurs were created along with all the other land and sea creatures as described in Genesis. Since man was created on day 6, man and dinosaurs were on the earth at the same time. Creationists reject the theory that the ages in the geologic column, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, represent millions of years, and that each of these periods had their own separate and distinct dinosaur species. All the different dinosaurs were on the earth at the same time. The worldwide flood occurred 1,650 years or so after creation. There were some dinosaurs on Noah's Ark, a pair of each kind. When the ark landed on dry land, dinosaurs were released to repopulate. The worldwide flood was the one and only extinction event, which killed all but the handful of dinosaurs on the ark. Many species went totally extinct at that point because they were not representatives of their kind that went on the ark. After the Tower of Babel, man broke into language groups and spread over the earth. When this happened, there was some contact between people and dinosaurs. There are records in ancient cultures of this contact, which includes the Bible. The term dinosaur had not been coined yet, but there are many references to dragons. After the flood and continuing after Babel, there was one ice age which gave rise to many types of mammals that adapted to the cold conditions and which killed off many of the remaining dinosaurs. These are very different views of dinosaurs and their place in God's creation. Before we get into sorting through all these conflicting beliefs, we should talk about fossils. Fossils are the remains of dead dinosaurs, bones, impressions, tracks. Nearly everything we know or think we know about dinosaurs comes from fossilized remains. Most fossils are found in rock, and in most cases they are rock, at least partially. Most of the dinosaur bones are no longer actually bone. They've been fossilized, which means that minerals have replaced the organic substances in the bones. Secular scientists hold that the mineralization process is very slow, taking millions of years. But many fossils contain actual non-mineralized bone, which should call into question the assertion that they are millions of years old. When the animal died, it had to be quickly covered with sediment in order to be fossilized, which later became rock. The bones contained in the sediment, because of the mineralization process, also became rock. The circumstances under which that would take place are generally described by evolutionists as rare, presumably to try to explain why so relatively few fossils of the larger dinosaurs have been found, considering that they were supposed to have been the dominant life form with vast herds covering the plains of North America for millions of years, as the sign at the museum says. For example, there have only been 30 Tyrannosaurus skeletons found, and only 330 Triceratops skeletons. Also rare are complete or near complete skeletons. What you see in a museum that looks like a whole skeleton is usually some actual fossilized bones along with many reconstructed bones that were actually made for that exhibit. Now, there's no real reason from the secular viewpoint why it should be as unusual as it is to find complete or near complete skeletons, but creationists have the answer. Creationists hold that the vast majority of fossilized remains came as a result of one event, the worldwide flood. The violent upheaval that accompanied the flood laid down many layers of sediment very quickly in many parts of the world, like the eruption of Mount St. Helens. These rapidly covered the remains of dead dinosaurs and possibly living ones as well, thus providing the rapid burial needed for fossilization. This is illustrated in the slide which shows a fossil ichthyosaurus which was buried and later fossilized while it was giving birth. The violence with which the layers formed also provides a better explanation of why the bones are often scattered or why bone beds have been found that have the remains of different dinosaurs mixed together. Mount St. Helens has also shown that under the right conditions, mineralization can actually take place fairly quickly and does not, in fact, require millions of years. As to why relatively few skeletons have been found, the creationist view is that dinosaurs were never that plentiful to begin with. They were not necessarily the dominant life form, just another species of animal. There's strong evidence that many of the dinosaurs died in water, even if they were land animals. One evidence is that complete or near complete skeletons of land dinosaurs often show a unique and distinctive death pose, with the head drawn back and the tail curved upward to almost form a loop. This is characteristic of animals who die in water, suggesting that many land dinosaurs drowned. And this is that Archaeopteryx fossil that was actually a bird, okay? Second, in the case of a particular type of land dinosaur, ankylosaurs, who are low to the ground and very heavy, over 70% are found upside down. Again, this suggests that the animals mostly drowned in water that was turbulent enough to flip them over. Both sets of evidence point to death in very turbulent water that accompanied the worldwide flood. The age of fossils continues to be a major point of contention. The idea that dinosaurs are millions of years old is central to the whole evolutionary worldview. Generally, secular scientists might determine the age of a fossil by doing radiometric dating on the surrounding rocks to determine their age. We've already talked about the limitations of this method, how it can give highly inaccurate results on rock where its age is known and quite a bit younger than the radiometric dating would indicate. They may often use the geologic column to date the fossil. In other words, the geologic column will slot various fossils into various geologic periods where the supposed age has been predetermined. Now, creationists basically disregard the underlying assumption of the geologic column that each layer took millions of years to form. First, there's the example of Mount St. Helens, which shows that sedimentary layers can form very quickly under catastrophic conditions, such as the worldwide flood. Also, if sedimentary layers form slowly over millions of years, one would expect to see signs of erosion between the layers, soil and plant growth, and animal activities such as burrowing. But in fact, there's not any of this, suggesting again that the layers were formed rapidly. And again, there are the polystrate fossils that we discussed earlier, the trees that lay across multiple layers, strongly suggesting that the layers formed rapidly during the flood. Now, a very strong indicator occurred recently to show that dinosaur fossils are in fact not millions of years old. To quote from the Titans book, page 189, "The discovery of soft tissue and other unfossilized organic biomolecules in dinosaur fossils has been one of the most exciting areas of creation research in the last quarter century. These discoveries are highly problematic for the idea of evolution and long ages. That's because real operational science can measure how quickly these would break down. Thus, none of the organic compounds should remain if they are really millions of years old." In 1990, Dr. Mary Schweitzer discovered T-Rex blood cells, red blood cells, in a bone that was unmineralized at its center. Not surprisingly, the researchers were harassed by skeptics who rejected the finds. As Dr. Schweitzer described, all hell broke loose. Although she's not a creationist, her career was at stake due to the huge disruption this would likely cause to the evolutionist establishment. This caused immediate consternation. Schweitzer's supervisor, who is a well-known paleontologist, Jack Horner, relates, "When Mary was first working on this material, she called me up to say she had found osteocytes, which are bone cells. I assumed she meant the spaces where the osteocytes would have been, which is what I suggested. No, Jack, actually, we have the cells. Mary, the freaking creationists are just going to love you." The significance of all this is that while mineralized fossils could, in theory at least, last millions of years, if they in fact had millions of years to last, soft tissue could not. Soft tissue would last less than 1 million years, and unless conditions were ideal for preservation, it would be a great deal less. As expected, despite these discoveries, evolutionary scientists continue to cling to the millions of years idea and try to come up with ways to rationalize the soft tissue being present. To do otherwise would be to admit that their worldview had been wrong and that the Earth may be a great deal younger than they believed. This they will never do, no matter what the scientific evidence may show. Now, as a digression, these discoveries mean that scientists may be able to extract and isolate dinosaur DNA. Is anyone else thinking what I am? Shades of Jurassic Park. Yikes. Okay, we'll get back to the talk now. Are birds really the evolutionary descendants of dinosaurs? Many evolutionists, and through them the general public, think so. It has become fashionable in recent years to believe that some dinosaurs evolved into birds, and that all modern birds have dinosaurs as their evolutionary ancestors. This idea has taken hold in the culture. I told the story of the visit to the Minnesota Zoo and its dinosaur display. Right there on the sign for the Velociraptor animatronic was the statement that this dinosaur was an ancestor of birds, as you may be able to read on the slide. And so, in the popular Jurassic Park movies, the velociraptors were portrayed as having bird-like movements. And there was a recently unveiled gigantic statue of a pigeon in Manhattan called Dinosaur to celebrate its evolutionary linkage. Now, this is not a new idea. That favorite dinosaur book of mine, circa 1960, taught me about Archaeopteryx, believed to be a transitional form between dinosaurs and modern birds. It looked like a bird with feathers and wings, but it also had teeth and a long tail, which were more reptile-like. But as time passed and our fossil knowledge grew, as is often the case, that thinking had to be revised. For one thing, there were no doubt about it birds that were found in layers which were older in terms of how evolutionists determine age. So how could Archaeopteryx represent a transitional form to something that preceded it? And the supposedly unique features of teeth and a tail have actually been found in a number of other true bird fossils, leading to the conclusion that Archaeopteryx was simply a type of bird, not a transitional form. Creationists, of course, contest the idea that dinosaurs, who are reptiles, could have evolved into birds based on the very different anatomy of the two types of animals. Wing structure, feathers, lung design, hip design, tail structure, bone structure are radically different in ways that strain credibility to think that one evolved into the other. For example, the idea that scales evolved into feathers, as Richard Dawkins once stated. Feathers are modified reptilian scales, way oversimplifies the challenge and falls before the reality of DNA complexity that could possibly bring that about. So if dinosaurs were created during Creation Week and lived on Earth for the first 1,656 years until the flood, does that mean they were on the ark? How could that possibly have worked? The creationist answer is yes. The Bible says that one pair of each kind of unclean animal went onto the ark, and that would include dinosaurs. The Titans book estimates that only 55 to 60 dinosaur kinds would have been on the ark. Compare this to over 1,500 species of dinosaurs that have been identified. So, for example, if one dinosaur, like a Triceratops, went on the ark, many other species that fall in that same kind would have been rendered extinct. Since the animals would be on the ark for a year, how would it work to take a pair of fearsome carnivores such as T-Rex? Well, it would work out okay if God sent them as immature juveniles who were fed and would not hunt for their food. And finally, how could such large animals fit on the ark? Fairly easily, actually. One thing to keep in mind is that most people have the wrong idea about the ark. It was huge. Illustrations in children's books with a few well-known animals filling a very small ark to the brim and looking like they might capsize it are wrong. A representative pair of each kind of dinosaurs as juveniles would not have been difficult to imagine fitting on the ark the size it really was. A similar question that is often brought to challenge the Bible is, if dinosaurs and man existed on Earth at the same time, why doesn't the Bible mention dinosaurs? Well, an easy answer is that the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs because the term had not been created at the time of the Wycliffe and King James translations. Also, keep in mind that while dinosaurs and man were on the earth at the same time, they did not necessarily occupy the same areas. So the people of the ancient Middle East may not have had a great deal of contact with the dinosaurs that were on the earth. But there are some references to animals that could be referring to dinosaurs. One very likely one is behemoth. This is in Job chapter 40, verses 15 through 18. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. This really sounds like a description of a huge dinosaur with a massive tail, and it doesn't describe any other kind of animal that I can think of. Leviathan is another great beast mentioned in the book of Job. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line? Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. That's from Job chapter 41. More interesting terminology surrounds the word dragon. Bodhi Hodge, in his book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible, points out that the Bible in its original text uses the Hebrew word for dragon at least 29 times. Dragons were recognized by a variety of ancient cultures, not just biblical ones, and were often described and portrayed as fearsome beasts. For example, the Chinese zodiac has a dragon as one of 12 animals, with the other 11 being, no doubt about it, real animals. Could at least some of these dragons have been dinosaurs? Dragons were generally accepted as real, though increasingly rare, up through the 1700s. By the 1800s, they were gone, nowhere to be found. In the 1800s, the scientific establishment of the day said that dragons, instead of being extinct real animals, were legendary beasts that never existed, although this is contrary to what people believed before the 1800s. When new Bible versions with new Bible translations came out, the use of the word dragon was now changed to use another word like jackal or wolf. This so as not to refer to creatures which were now ruled to never have existed. Compare Isaiah chapter 34, verse 13, between the King James Version, authorized in 1611, and the New King James Version, as shown on this slide. The King James Version says, "And thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof. It shall be an habitation of dragons and a court for owls." The habitation of dragons was changed in the New King James Version to a habitation of jackals. So modern versions since the 1800s don't refer to dragons, which may have been dinosaurs, even though the Hebrew originals and earlier versions did. Now, is there evidence outside the Bible that man and dinosaurs coexisted? Well, yes, there is. The Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air book and the Bodhi Hodge books list many examples of evidence that shows that people must have seen dinosaurs. Some examples are this Mesopotamia cylinder seal. Cylinder seals dating back to ancient Mesopotamia seem to portray a long-necked dinosaur. Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible by Bodhi Hodge discusses numerous interactions between man and what were called at the time dragons. One example from the Roman legions in North Africa. The Roman historian Cassius Dio recounted how a Roman army once killed a dragon. One day, when Regulus, a Roman consul, was fighting against Carthage, a dragon suddenly crept up and settled behind the wall of the Roman army. The Romans killed it by order of Regulus, skinned it, and sent the hide to the Roman Senate. When the dragon's hide, as Dio says, was measured by order of the Senate, it happened to be, amazingly, 120 feet long. This sounds like a real animal, possibly a dinosaur. Now here's a Chinese wine vessel, a 3rd century AD, 200 AD to 300 AD, wine vessel, has handles carved as creatures that look very much like a dinosaur. Ancient Chinese art commonly depicts dragons. In the older pieces especially, the dragons often look like dinosaurs. John of Damascus, 675 to 749 AD, wrote extensively on dragons as actual animals, sounding very much like dinosaurs, and not magical or legendary creatures. But by his time, dragon sightings had already become rare. And then there are the well-known stories, often thought to be legends, such as Beowulf. Beowulf is an epic poem from 1000 AD about a Scandinavian hero who slew the monster Grendel among other dragons. The verifiable detail, including the verified burial site of Beowulf himself, would be very unusual for a completely legendary story. And the description of the dragon that he slew sounds a lot like a Tyrannosaurus or similar dinosaur. Cambodia's Angkor Wat carving. This complex of temples is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a major tourist attraction. One of the temples is decorated with carvings of animals on its walls and pillars, and one of those animals clearly seems to be a stegosaurus. How, in 1186, would the carver of the temple figures been able to accurately portray a stegosaurus, along with the monkeys, parrots, water buffalo, and other animals, if not from someone's first-hand observations? In England, a dragon was painted inside St. Mary's Church in the 1300s to commemorate an actual dragon slaying nearby. It's still there today. Also in England, in the Carlisle Cathedral, the tomb of Bishop Bell from around 1496 has brass engravings of a long-necked dinosaur. In France, the Château de Chambord, King Francois I castle, has a tapestry from Belgium that seems to portray a duck-billed dinosaur. This portrayal goes back to the early 1500s. Now, is it possible that dinosaurs still exist? I would love it if someone found a Tyrannosaurus still living in some remote corner of the globe. When I was young, I checked a book out of the Rock Island, Illinois Public Library called On the Track of Unknown Animals by Bernard Wavelmans. The book was written in 1958, so it was a little old even when I read it. Wavelmans is credited with initiating the subculture called cryptozoology, where people speculate on the continued existence of prehistoric and/or legendary creatures in remote parts of the world. But every year, the world gets a little smaller, figuratively, and remote corners become fewer and fewer. I sadly have to agree with most creationists that dinosaurs probably no longer exist. They were never as plentiful as evolutionists would have us believe. The great majority of them were drowned in the flood. Those on the ark survived and repopulated to some extent, but as man spread out over the globe after the Tower of Babel, they competed with all large animals for habitat. And dinosaurs, dragons, being the largest land animals ever, they needed the largest areas of habitat. Just as tigers and other large animals in the modern world face extinction from competition with man, so did the dinosaurs meet their demise in earlier ages. And of course, the Ice Age that occurred at this time changed their environment and further hastened their extinction. As time went on, references to contact with dragons became fewer, and the dragons were described less like great animals and more like mythical creatures. If any dinosaurs survived to the present day, it would be the seagoing kind in the world's oceans, though there is no proof of actual dinosaur survival there either. However, despite the evolutionist claim that all prehistoric creatures died out millions of years ago, in 1939, some fishermen in Africa netted a prehistoric fish called a coelacanth that was a contemporary with the dinosaurs. It was a fish, not a reptile, but the fact that it was still around in 1939 suggests that the dinosaurs didn't live as long ago as the evolutionists claim. The coelacanth is often referred to as a living fossil. Now I would like to talk about two events described in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, the worldwide flood, and Genesis chapters 10 and 11, the Tower of Babel. Both of these are dismissed by secularists today as a myth, but there is non-biblical evidence to support their truth, including a very interesting connection between them. The flood I've talked about a number of times before. Non-biblical evidence that supports the truth of the worldwide flood includes a catastrophic flood is the best explanation for various features of the Earth's geology, such as the Grand Canyon and rock stratification. We have discussed this already. A catastrophic flood provides the best explanation of why the fossil record is the way it is, also discussed before. There are at least 250 other ancient cultures that also have flood legends, many of which involve saving animals and coming to rest on a mountaintop as the flood waters recede. If this event did not happen, why would so many cultures have these stories with so many basic similarities? Finally, the worldwide flood gives the best explanation for the conditions which can create an ice age, which secular scientists have no plausible explanation for, and which began immediately after Noah landed the ark, 1,657 years after creation. The ice age, in turn, explains other geographic features of our world, and it also provides a means through which mankind could disperse throughout the globe. Now, speaking of the ice age, secular scientists believe there have been 5, but have no explanation for what caused any of them. Creationists believe only in 1, but they have a good explanation for it, going back to the worldwide flood. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." That means that the earth's crust was torn apart, and huge geysers of water spouted forth. These fountains continued gushing for 5 months. Genesis chapter 7, verse 24 says, "And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Then, as in Psalm 104, verses 8 and 9, "The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they, the waters, may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Tremendous forces changed the surface of the earth. Volcanic activity continued." So, the first 150 days of flooding explain the fossils, including the marine fossils on the top of Mount Everest, and rock layers and the receding waters explain the erosion surfaces and deep canyons. The hot oceans from the subterranean water is the explanation for conditions that started the Ice Age. The warm oceanic water caused great evaporation into clouds and snow, and the massive volcanic eruptions would have poured ash into the air, blocking much sunlight, leaving the land colder, especially colder summers, so the ice doesn't melt each season. These conditions created massive ice sheets on land at high latitudes. That meant ocean levels lowered, and the land bridges were exposed, including, for example, to Australia. When the ice sheet retreated, leaving what we see here in Wisconsin geography, such as the Kettle Moraine in southeast Wisconsin and the Terminal Moraine near Cross Plains, just 10 miles west of Madison, the melting ice raised the sea levels, covering the land bridges, which then isolated certain areas after some animals and people groups had arrived there. We go from the flood to the Ice Age, and from there directly to the Tower of Babel and the dispersal of people groups around the world. The secular scenario of how humanity populated the world theorizes that modern humans developed in Africa around 300,000 years ago. About 60,000 years ago, they began to spread out all over the world. Presumably, this was after having been content to spend their first 240,000 years without leaving Africa. No reason given on why man decided to spread everywhere after 240,000 years of apparently not having been interested in leaving Africa. They left no records of language or civilization behind, and after leaving Africa 60,000 years ago, the first major civilization finally sprang up in Mesopotamia a few thousand years ago, followed very quickly by a number of others. Major civilizations that finally sprang up very close to each other, beginning just a few thousand years ago, include Mesopotamia, which includes Babylon, Egypt, Greece, India, China, and Peru, and in Mexico with the Aztecs and the Mayans. Now, is there anything about this scenario that seems odd? I will let secular archaeologists and anthropologists point out a couple. Ruth Shady, a secular archaeologist, commented on a recent find saying that it raises questions about what prompted civilizations to form throughout the planet at about the same time. She said that last year, or this year in 2025, or at least it's reported on the creation.com website. Or this comment on the origin of world languages. One of the greatest mysteries of prehistory is how people in widely separated places suddenly and spontaneously developed the capacity for language at roughly the same time. It was as if people carried around in their heads a genetic alarm clock that suddenly went off around the world and led different groups of in widely scattered places on every continent to create languages. Okay, that was from the book Mother Tongue in 1991. The secularists have no answer to these questions. But if we take a close look at the Bible's narrative in the Tower of Babel, these problems will be solved. Where does the Tower of Babel fit on the biblical timeline? First, we will zero in on Peleg, who will be our benchmark to fix the time for the division of humanity. Peleg was 5 generations from Noah and 5 generations before Abraham. Luke chapter 3, verse 35 mentions Peleg in Jesus' genealogy. Peleg was born 100 years after Noah left the ark. Both Genesis chapter 10, verse 25, and 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 19 use the same language. Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Interestingly, Peleg is a Hebrew word for division. This is important to place the time of the dispersal of people groups throughout the world with their different languages and forming different cultures after the Tower of Babel as described in Genesis chapter 11. So, what happened in Peleg's lifetime? Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. Chapter 11, verse 4 says, the people said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. But God had told Noah in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. The people were disobedient again, because while they were fruitful and multiplied, they showed no inclination to fill the earth as God directed. In fact, did you catch the part in verse 4 where they said, let us make a name for ourselves? The tower builders wanted independence from God, wanted a tower to reach the heavens as a monument to their own power, and even secure their safety from another flood, because they disbelieved God's covenant not to flood the earth once more. So the Lord said in chapter 11, verses 7 through 9, come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all earth. Now, allowing for the minor discrepancies between secular carbon-14 dating and the biblical timeline, this answers the secularist problem of explaining the sudden growth in civilizations. The people groups that were dispersed from Babel were already civilized and brought their civilization and new languages with them to the places they settled. And it is logical to note that the order in which the major civilizations arose is consistent with a fanning out from the Middle East to areas further away, as we would expect. Now, what does the Ice Age have to do with all this? Peleg's 239-year lifetime was in the first half of the 700-year Ice Age, when the land bridges connected the continents, allowing the people groups to scatter over the face of the earth, especially to places like Australia, Japan, Britain, various small islands, and North and South America. This is the connection between the flood, the Ice Age, and the Tower of Babel. As the ice melted and the glaciers receded, the ocean's water level rose, and many of those places are cut off from further migration. Also, as the glaciers melted and the ocean's water level rose, some newly settled coastal cities were flooded. Many ancient structures have been found intact underwater in the oceans, just off the current coastline, such as in Japan, India, and Lebanon. All this gives support to the creationist view of the Ice Age and when it occurred. Now, the phenomenon of languages that all seem to have sprung up at the same time can be explained by looking at Genesis chapter 10, which is often called the Table of Nations. Genesis chapter 10, verse 32 says, "These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations in their nations. And from these the nations were divided on the face of divided on the earth after the flood. That is, when the Tower of Babel was attempted to be built. And each of these nations ended up with its own language." Now, although there are now over 6,900 spoken languages in the world, 2 language statistic companies have analyzed that they came from only 94 root languages. When looking at the Bible's Table of Nations, with all dispersed families having different languages, the number of people groups that would have received a language is approximately what modern analysis says would be expected based on the number of root languages. Now, another perspective on this is to look at world population trends. Over the past 220 years or so, the Earth's population has gone from 1 billion people to 8 billion people, from 1800 to 2020. Working backward, think about how long it would have taken that first billion to get here. Going back to Noah would be about 4,100 years from 1800. The secular timeline says modern man began about 300,000 years ago. Given how quickly the human population has grown in the last 200 years, which time frame seems more reasonable to think it took for that first billion? Some secular scientists recognize this disconnect in their reasoning. Regarding the incredibly small human population growth in terms of evolutionary theory, scientists admit, you've got to come up with a hypothesis for an event that wiped out the vast majority of the human population, something that caused the human population to drop drastically. When or how often that may have happened is anybody's guess. That's a quote from someone named Lee Dye on the abcnews.com in 1999. Once again, the evidence fits the Bible much better than secular theory. So, once again, we can see that the Bible is real history, not just a story or allegory. Even more things support the truth of the account of the Tower of Babel and what happened as a result. One example is the prevalence of pyramids and ziggurats, which are basically different forms of towers in the architecture of civilizations around the world, arising at about the same time from the dispersal of people groups. Okay, so that brings us to the close of tonight's talk. Hopefully, I've been able to show that the evolutionist theories are far from airtight, that there actually is a great deal of evidence that supports the biblical worldview. And a common thread that runs through this discussion is that the more we learn through observational science, the less likely seems the secular worldview, and the more reasonable seems the biblical one. Tomorrow at worship, I will conclude my talks with the theological ramifications of an evolutionary worldview and some of the horrible damage that worldview has done in modern history. Let us now conclude with a prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to consider your word and your creation. Help us keep our faith in your revealed word and in your plan of salvation. We look forward to the day when that plan reaches its finish and we can join you in heaven. In the name of Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Okay.